The atmosphere inside the massive concert hall was thick with tension. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving everyone feeling heavy and tired. This was the final round of the most prestigious music competition in the country, a place where only the best musicians dared to step foot. But today, the magic was missing. The energy was dead. The producers of the show were desperate. They wanted high ratings, so they decided to do something crazy. They added a surprise round to the competition. They told the contestants that they would have to play a piece of music that was known for being impossible. It was a composition called The Storm's Fury, written by a genius composer who was known for being cruel with his notes. The music was so complex that it required hands to move faster than the eye could see, and it demanded a level of emotional depth that usually takes a person a lifetime to learn. It wasn't just a test of skill, it was a test of sanity. One by one, the older contestants walked onto the stage. These were people who had spent their entire lives practicing. Some were in their 20s, others in their 30s. They held degrees from the best music schools in the world. They looked confident when they walked out, but the moment they sat down at the grand piano, you could see the fear in their eyes. The first contestant was a man who looked very serious. He adjusted his tuxedo, took a deep breath, and placed his fingers on the keys. He started off strong, but just a minute into the piece, his hands got tangled. The music was too fast. He missed a note, then another, and finally, he just stopped. He shook his head, stood up, and walked away, looking defeated. The audience let out a quiet sigh of sympathy. The next contestant was a young woman with a very rigid posture. She tried to play the piece perfectly, focusing on every single note. But because she was thinking so hard, she lost the feeling of the music. When the really hard part came, her fingers froze. She looked at the judges with panic in her eyes, unable to continue. She stood up and rushed off the stage, holding back tears. This pattern continued for the next hour. Person after person tried to conquer the storm's fury, and person after person failed miserably. It was painful to watch. The music was just too hard. It was like asking someone to climb a mountain without any gear. The judges, usually the picture of patience and professionalism, started to look exhausted. The main judge, a man known for his sharp ear and harsh criticism, was actually rubbing his temples. He looked like he had a headache. He took off his glasses and cleaned them, even though they weren't dirty. It was a nervous habit. He looked over at the producers and signaled with his eyes that enough was enough. He was ready to call it a day. The judges had given up. They didn't believe that anyone could play the piece properly. They felt that asking musicians to perform this song was a cruel joke. The audience was bored and restless. People were checking their watches. Some were even starting to leave their seats to go get a snack or use the restroom. The excitement of the competition had turned into a long, boring torture session. The magic of music, which usually brought everyone together, was completely gone. It seemed like the day was a total waste. Nobody expected anything good to happen. The judges were ready to pack up their bags, the audience was ready to go home, and the hope of finding a true winner had disappeared. Then, just as the head judge was about to stand up and announce that the competition was over, a small noise echoed from the back of the stage. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was enough to make people stop and look. A little girl, who looked no older than 8 years old, walked out from the side curtains. She looked tiny compared to the massive black piano sitting in the center of the stage. She was wearing a simple dress that looked a little bit too big for her, and her shoes made a soft clicking sound on the wooden floor. She had a ribbon in her hair, and she held herself with a quiet confidence that was confusing to see in a child. The people in the audience started to whisper. They looked at each other with raised eyebrows. Was this a joke? Was she lost? The parents in the audience smiled sympathetically, thinking she was perhaps a relative of one of the staff members who had wandered onto the stage by accident. The judges, however, did not smile. They looked annoyed. They thought the producers were playing a prank on them. They thought this was a comedy act to lighten the mood after so many failures. They weren't in the mood to play games. The announcer looked at his card with a confused expression. He shuffled his papers, cleared his throat, and read out the name written there. And now, please welcome Ilora. That was it. Just Ilora. There was no long list of awards. There was no mention of famous teachers or music conservatories. There wasn't even a hometown listed. It was just a first name. The silence in the room grew even heavier. The judges slumped back in their chairs, crossing their arms. They decided they would give the child 30 seconds. If she was terrible, they would stop her immediately to save her from embarrassment and themselves from boredom. Ilora didn't seem to notice the tension in the room. She didn't look at the judges, and she didn't look at the hundreds of people staring at her. Her eyes were fixed only on the piano. She walked up to the bench, but she had a problem. The bench was set too high for her short legs. She struggled for a moment, hopping up and down once, before she managed to climb onto the seat. She had to slide forward so that her toes could barely reach the gold pedals on the floor. She wiggled a bit to get comfortable, settled her dress, and placed her small hands on the keys. Her hands were so small that they looked like little starfish resting on the sleek black and white ivory. The head judge checked his watch. He was counting down the seconds in his head. He raised his hands slightly, getting ready to signal the announcer to cut the music the moment the girl played a wrong note. Everyone waited, expecting to hear a messy, childish version of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, or perhaps a clumsy attempt at a simple scale. They expected her to freeze up and cry under the pressure of the bright lights and the stern faces looking down at her. But Ilora just took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a split second to focus, and then, she began. She didn't play a child's song. She launched directly into the terrifying The Storm's fury. And in that moment, everything changed. As soon as the girl touched the keys, the heavy and boring feeling in the concert hall disappeared instantly. The sound wasn't soft or hesitant like everyone expected. It was a shock to the system. The first note she hit was a deep, resonant chord that seemed to vibrate right through the floorboards and up into the seats of the audience. It was a sound that demanded attention, a sound that said, "I am here, and I mean business." The judge in the middle, the one who was just about to raise his hand to stop the performance, froze. His hand was still in the air, but he forgot to bring it down. His mouth, which was previously set in a firm line of annoyance, dropped open slightly. The pen he was holding to mark a low score slipped from his fingers and landed on the desk with a soft click, but he didn't even flinch. He couldn't look away. The audience, who were busy checking their phones or whispering to their neighbors, suddenly snapped their heads toward the stage. The tired atmosphere vanished, replaced by a sudden, intense curiosity. People stopped fidgeting. They stopped looking at the exit doors. All eyes were fixed on the tiny figure sitting behind the massive instrument. The piece she was playing, The Storm's Fury, started with a fast and chaotic melody. It was designed to sound like rain pelting against a roof, growing louder and faster with every second. Usually, professional musicians would hunch their shoulders and tense up their necks when playing this part because their fingers would get tangled in the difficult jumps. but Illyra played with a strange kind of ease. She didn't look tense. In fact, she looked like she was enjoying herself. Her small hands moved across the keyboard with a speed that was hard to follow. Because her hands were small, she couldn't stretch her fingers to reach the wide notes that an adult could. To make up for this, she used her whole body. When she needed to hit a low note on the left side and a high note on the right side at the same time, she didn't just stretch her fingers. She leaned her whole upper body to the left, then quickly pivoted to the right. Her braids flew through the air as she moved. It looked like she was dancing with the piano rather than just playing it. There was a raw energy in her playing that was completely different from the professionals who had played before. The adults had played the music perfectly, but they played it like they were solving a math problem. They were focused on not making mistakes. Illyra, on the other hand, wasn't worried about the rules. She wasn't thinking about the technique. She was just feeling the music. She attacked the keys with a sort of joyful aggression. The sound was powerful and loud, filling the entire huge hall without the need for any microphones. The hardest part of the first section was a run of notes that went up and down the scale at lightning speed. It was a trap where almost every other contestant had stumbled. If you missed one note, the whole flow fell apart like a house of cards. As Illyra approached this difficult part, the audience held its breath. It felt like the whole room was leaning forward in their seats. People were waiting for the mistake. They were waiting for the little girl to stop and realize the music was too hard for her. But she didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. Her fingers, which looked so delicate and fragile, transformed into precise instruments. They landed on every white key and every black key exactly where they were supposed to. The notes cascaded out of the piano like a waterfall, smooth and continuous. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. It was as if her hands had a mind of their own, guided by some innate musical sense that couldn't be taught in a school. The silence in the room was different now. Before, it was a silence of boredom and impatience. Now, it was a silence of awe. Nobody could believe what they were hearing. It was impossible, yet it was happening right in front of their eyes and ears. The judges, who had seen thousands of musicians over their long careers, exchanged looks with each other. They didn't need to speak. Their faces said it all. They were witnessing something rare. The judge on the left, a woman known for being very critical and stern, stopped writing completely. She took off her reading glasses and let them hang around her neck. Her eyes were wide, focused entirely on the child's hands. She was trying to figure out how an 8-year-old could have such control. It was a mystery to her. Even the technicians in the back of the hall, who were usually busy adjusting lights and sound levels, stopped working. They stood frozen in the shadows, watching the small girl on the stage. They had heard the best musicians in the world play on that stage, but this was different. This felt personal. It felt like the girl was telling a story through the music, a story that everyone could understand but nobody could put into words. The music continued to build in intensity. It was loud and dramatic, crashing like waves against a cliff. But then, quite suddenly, the chaos began to settle. The fast notes slowed down, the loud chords became softer. Illyra's movements changed, too. She wasn't bouncing around anymore. She became very still. Her posture relaxed. She leaned closer to the keys, almost as if she was sharing a secret with the instrument. The transition was seamless. There was no awkward pause or break. She guided the music from the loud, stormy opening into a gentle, quiet middle section. This part of the song was known for being tricky not because it was fast, but because it was slow. In slow music, every mistake is heard clearly. There is nowhere to hide. The musician has to play with incredible control to keep the notes from fading away too quickly. This was usually where the professionals failed because they were too stiff from the effort of the first part. But Ilora played the slow section with a tenderness that made people's hearts ache. The sound she produced was singing and sweet, like a mother humming a lullaby. She pressed the keys softly, drawing out a tone that was warm and beautiful. The contrast between the loud storm she had just played and this gentle melody was shocking. It showed a level of maturity and understanding that seemed impossible for her age. The audience was completely captivated. You could feel the emotion in the room. Some people closed their eyes to just listen better. Others had tears welling up, though they didn't quite know why. It wasn't just because the music was beautiful, it was because the source of the music was so unexpected. It was a reminder that greatness doesn't always come from experience or degrees. Sometimes, it just comes from a pure, natural gift. Ilora sat on the big bench, her feet barely touching the pedals, looking more like a doll than a human being, yet she was controlling the mood of hundreds of people. She didn't look at the crowd to see if they were impressed. She didn't look at the judges for approval. Her eyes were closed, her head swaying slightly to the rhythm. She was lost in her own world, a world where the piano was her best friend and the music was her language. As the slow melody drifted through the air, the judges leaned back in their chairs, completely surrendering to the moment. They weren't judging anymore. They weren't thinking about scores or rankings. They were just listening, like regular music fans. The strictness left their faces, replaced by looks of wonder. The head judge, who had been ready to leave just a few minutes ago, was now sitting on the edge of his seat. He had forgotten all about his headache. He had forgotten all about the failures of the day. All he could see was the little girl and all he could hear was the magic she was creating. The impossible challenge of the day had suddenly turned into the most memorable performance the hall had ever seen. The little girl who wasn't supposed to be there was showing them all how it was really done. As the gentle melody of the middle section faded away, a quiet hush fell over the room once more. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, but also the moment everyone was dreading. The composition was about to enter its final and most dangerous phase, the cadenza of the lightning. This was the part of the music that had made grown men and women shake their heads and walk off the stage in defeat. It was a section designed to break the spirit of the pianist. It required hands to move in opposite directions at breakneck speeds, playing notes that were so far apart it felt unnatural for the human body to attempt them. Ilora did not hesitate. She didn't take a deep breath to prepare herself like the adults did. She didn't grimace or tighten her shoulders. She simply felt the change in the rhythm and her hands snapped into action. Suddenly, the soft, lullaby-like sound was gone, replaced by a roaring fury of sound that filled every corner of the massive hall. Her hands moved so fast that they looked like they were vibrating. If you blinked, you felt like you might miss something. The sound coming from the piano wasn't just a series of notes, it was like a thunderstorm had been trapped inside the instrument and was desperately trying to get out. The bass notes rumbled like heavy thunder, while the high notes sparkled like sharp strikes of lightning. The contrast was terrifying and beautiful all at once. The audience was gripped with a tension that was almost painful to feel. Hundreds of people were sitting on the edges of their seats. Nobody was breathing properly. Everyone was staring at the stage, their eyes wide, afraid that if they looked away for even a second, the spell would break. The silence of the crowd was absolute, except for the roaring sound of the piano. It felt like the entire world had stopped spinning just to listen to this one little girl play. Usually, when a pianist plays this fast, They make faces. They scrunch up their noses, they open their mouths in effort, or their bodies shake with the strain of trying to control their muscles. But Illyra's face was calm. It was a strange thing to witness. Her body was working incredibly hard, her legs were stretching to reach the pedals, her arms were flying up and down the keyboard, but her expression remained peaceful. She looked like she was floating above the music, guiding it with an invisible string. She wasn't fighting the piano, she was working with it. Then came the moment that usually defined the end for most players. The music demanded a series of jumps. The left hand had to play a low note while the right hand had to jump all the way to the highest end of the piano and then instantly snap back to the middle. It was like asking a sprinter to run a marathon while jumping over hurdles. It required precise aim. If you missed the key by even an inch, the sound would be wrong, and the flow would be broken. If you hesitated, even for a millisecond, the rhythm would be lost. The judge on the far left, a man who always looked grumpy and bored, leaned forward. His eyes were scanning her hands, looking for the slip. He was convinced that an 8-year-old couldn't possibly have the coordination to nail this part. He expected to see her fumble, to hear the clunk of a wrong note, to see her panic. He saw so many talented players fail at this exact spot that it was ingrained in his mind that it was impossible. But Illyra didn't fumble. When her right hand flew up the keyboard, it landed with the precision of a needle hitting a record groove. When she had to jump back down, she didn't even look at her hand. She knew exactly where the keys were. It was as if she had a map of the piano burned into her mind. The notes rang out clear and true. There was no clumsiness, only speed and grace. She continued through the difficult passage, note after note, perfect and clean. The speed increased again. It seemed like the music was racing toward a cliff, getting faster and faster, heading toward a chaotic end. The girl was a blur of motion. Her dress swayed with her movements, and her hair bounced around, but she never lost balance. She was completely in control of the chaos. The people in the front row could feel the vibration of the piano in the floor. It made their hearts beat faster. A young boy sitting with his parents opened his mouth in amazement, his eyes fixed on the girl's flying hands. He had never seen anyone move that fast in real life. It wasn't like a cartoon, it was real, and it was happening right in front of him. Even the camera operators, who were used to watching events through a lens, were captivated. One of them, usually focused on getting the right focus and lighting, found himself just watching the monitor. He forgot to zoom in. He was just mesmerized by the performance. It was rare to see someone so small command so much power. It made him feel like anything was possible, like he had been underestimating people his whole life. As the piece neared its final climax, the music swelled. The fast notes turned into thick, heavy chords that required both hands to strike the keys together with great force. Illyra leaned into it. She put her whole body weight behind the notes, making the piano sound like an entire orchestra was playing. The sound was huge, echoing off the high ceiling of the hall. The judges, who just a short while ago were packing up their things and looking at their watches, were now paralyzed. They weren't thinking about the next contestant or the dinner reservations they had made. They were completely present in the moment. The head judge, a man who had heard the world's best pianists for 30 years, realized he was hearing something unique. He wasn't hearing a student practicing a lesson. He was hearing a natural genius expressing herself. It made him feel humble. There is a special kind of magic when a child does something extraordinary. It touches a soft spot in the human heart that is hard to explain. It makes adults question why they make things so complicated. Watching Illyra, everyone felt a sense of purity. She wasn't playing for money or for a trophy. She wasn't playing to please the judges. She was playing because the music was inside her and it needed to come out. That honesty translated through the piano and hit everyone in the room like a wave. The tempo pushed to the limit. The rapid-fire notes were cascading down like a waterfall, rushing toward the final impact. It was dizzying to hear. The complexity of the rhythm was mind-boggling, yet the girl never faltered. She didn't miss a single beat. The accuracy was 100%. It was a mathematical perfection combined with raw emotion, a combination that almost never exists. Just when the audience thought it couldn't get any faster or more intense, the music suddenly stopped. It wasn't a slow fade out. It was a complete, sudden cut-off. Ilara's hands came down on the final two chords with a force that surprised everyone. Boom. Silence. The vibrations of the final notes hung in the air, swirling around the room, slowly fading into nothingness. Ilara pulled her hands away from the keys and placed them gently in her lap. She sat there on the huge bench, tiny and still, contrasting with the massive noise she had just created. She didn't jump up to take a bow. She didn't look around for applause. She just sat there, blinking, looking down at the keys, perhaps checking to make sure they were still there, or perhaps just coming back from the magical place the music had taken her. The concert hall remained silent. It wasn't the silence of boredom anymore. It was the silence of shock. It was the kind of silence that happens when something is so beautiful or so unbelievable that you don't know how to react. 3 seconds passed. 5 seconds passed. Nobody moved. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick. It felt like the air was electric, like a single spark would cause an explosion. The judges were staring at the stage, unmoving. The audience was holding their breath. Time seemed to have stopped inside that hall, waiting for the world to catch up with what they had just seen. The impossible had just happened, and nobody was quite ready to wake up from the dream. The silence that filled the concert hall was heavy, but it wasn't an empty silence. It was the kind of quiet that happens when something so shocking occurs that the human brain needs a few seconds to process it. For 5 long seconds, nobody moved. The air in the room seemed to be vibrating with the memory of the music that had just been played. Hundreds of people sat frozen in their seats, their eyes glued to the small figure sitting on the massive piano bench. Ilara sat still, her hands resting quietly in her lap. She looked calm, almost as if she had just finished doing her homework rather than performing a musical miracle. She didn't look nervous, and she didn't look proud. She just looked like a child who had finished a task she needed to do. She blinked a couple of times, looking around the hall with a shy, innocent expression, as if she was wondering why everyone was being so quiet. On the stage, the tension shifted. During the performance, the tension had been about the difficulty of the music, the fear of a mistake. Now, the tension was purely emotional. It was the feeling of a dam about to burst. The people in the audience were holding their breath without even realizing it. They looked at each other with wide eyes, searching for confirmation that what they had just heard was real. It felt like waking up from a vivid dream and trying to hold on to the details before they fade away. The judges were the most affected. For years, they had sat in those high chairs, listening to thousands of musicians. They had heard perfect notes played by robots and emotional music played by artists with poor technique. But they had rarely heard perfection combined with such raw, innocent emotion. The head judge, the man who was ready to leave earlier, felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at the other judges, and he saw that his own feelings were reflected on their faces. They looked humbled. They looked like students who had just been taught a lesson by a master. Then, the spell broke. It started with a single person in the back row. It was a loud clap, followed by a shout of bravo. It was like a spark in a dry forest. Suddenly, the entire hall erupted. It wasn't a slow clap, it was an explosion of sound. People jumped to their feet so fast that their seats slammed against the backs of the chairs. The applause was deafening, louder than anything the hall had heard in years. It was a roar of pure joy and disbelief. Men and women were clapping their hands raw, shouting words of praise that were lost in the noise. Some people were whistling, others were stomping their feet. The energy in the room shifted from shock to pure excitement. It was like a giant weight had been lifted off everyone's shoulders. The frustration of the long day, the boredom of the failed performances, the skepticism about the competition, all of it washed away in that moment of celebration. Elora seemed surprised by the noise. She flinched slightly as the roar hit her. She looked out into the crowd, her eyes wide, trying to see past the bright stage lights. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. A shy smile spread across her face, a small and genuine smile that made the audience love her even more. She didn't stand up to take a bow immediately. She just sat there, soaking it in, waving a little hand at the blur of people. The judges stood up, too. This was a rare honor. Usually, they remained seated until the very end of the ceremony. But this time, they couldn't help themselves. The stern female judge in the middle was clapping slowly, with tears streaming down her cheeks. She wasn't wiping them away, she let them fall. She looked at Elora not as a judge, but as a mother, feeling a protective instinct for the little girl. The head judge removed his jacket, feeling hot with emotion, and clapped his hands together firmly. He nodded at the stage, a deep sign of respect. He knew he had seen a once-in-a-lifetime talent. The camera operators focused in on the girl's face. On the big screens above the stage, her expression was visible to everyone. She looked a little overwhelmed, but mostly she looked happy. She didn't have the arrogance of a star. She had the joy of a child who loves what she does. That joy was contagious. It spread through the crowd, making people smile at strangers. For a few minutes, there was no competition, no judgment, no rich or poor. There was just a shared human experience of witnessing something beautiful. The applause continued for a long time. It went on for minutes, not seconds. People didn't want to stop. They wanted the moment to last forever. It was as if they were afraid that if they stopped clapping, the girl would disappear, or they would wake up and realize it was all a dream. The noise was thunderous, echoing off the walls and the high ceiling. Finally, realizing that the noise wasn't going to stop, Elora decided she should acknowledge the crowd properly. She slid off the bench. Her legs were too short to jump down gracefully and smoothed out her dress. She walked to the front of the stage, the wooden heels of her shoes clicking softly. The noise grew even louder as she approached the edge of the stage. She gave a small, clumsy curtsy. It wasn't a professional stage bow. It was the curtsy of an 8-year-old girl, practiced maybe in front of a mirror at home. It was imperfect, but it was perfect in its own way. The audience awed at the sight of it. It grounded the situation again. It reminded them that standing before them was not a machine or a trained seal, but a human being. A child. A child who had done the impossible. As she stood back up, she looked at the judges' table. She raised her hand and gave a little wave. The head judge smiled back at her, a genuine, warm smile that softened his entire face. He signaled to the announcer to let her know she could go, but nobody wanted her to leave. The stage manager came out to help her off the stage, gently guiding her toward the side curtains. As she walked away, she didn't look like a conquering hero. She looked like she was ready for a snack and a nap. She rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand, a sign that the adrenaline was wearing off and she was getting tired. It was a human moment that endeared her to everyone watching. She wasn't a superhero, she was just a little girl who had worked very hard. When she finally disappeared behind the curtains, the audience slowly began to sit down, but the atmosphere remained electric. People were talking excitedly to their neighbors, replaying the performance in their minds. They were discussing the speed of her fingers, the power of her sound, and the look on her face. It was the kind of performance that people would tell their grandchildren about. "I was there," they would say. "I saw the girl who played the impossible song." The judges were in a huddle, talking animatedly. They knew the competition was effectively over. How could they give the prize to anyone else after what they had just seen? It would be a joke. The rules of the competition didn't seem to matter anymore. The spirit of the music had won. They felt a renewed sense of purpose. Their boredom was gone, replaced by a passion for the art that they hadn't felt in years. This little girl had reminded them why they loved music in the first place. Backstage, the crew members surrounded Illyra. Some were kneeling down to talk to her, others were offering her water and juice. She looked a bit dazed by all the attention, smiling shyly as patted her on the back. She didn't understand the magnitude of what she had done. To her, she just played a song she liked. She didn't know that she had defied the odds, silenced the critics, and changed the lives of everyone who heard her play. She was just happy that she didn't make any mistakes. The lights in the concert hall dimmed slightly, signaling a break. But nobody left. Everyone stayed in their seats, buzzing with excitement. They knew they had just witnessed history. They knew that the video of this performance would be shared around the world. But more than that, they knew they had felt a genuine connection. Through the keys of a piano, an 8-year-old had spoken to their hearts, and for that brief moment, the world was a little less heavy, a little less cynical, and a whole lot more beautiful. As the bright stage lights were dimmed to signal a break, the atmosphere in the concert hall did not return to the tired, bored mood of earlier. Instead, the air was filled with a buzzing energy, like electricity was running through the seats. People were not checking their phones or looking for the exit. Instead, they were turned toward one another, their faces flushed with excitement, talking in loud, eager whispers. It was the kind of reaction you usually only see at a championship sports game when the underdog team scores the winning goal in the very last second. But here, the athlete was an 8-year-old girl, and her game had been a solitary performance on a piano. Backstage, the scene was chaotic but in a happy, celebratory way. The crew members, who were usually focused on moving cables and adjusting microphones, had all gathered around the small green room. Illyra was sitting on a high chair, her legs dangling, sipping from a bottle of orange juice. She looked tiny compared to the adults surrounding her. Her face was still a bit pink from the heat of the stage lights, and her hair was slightly messy from her energetic performance. She looked like any tired child after a long day of school, except that she was being treated like a queen. The competition organizer, a man who usually walked around with a stressed frown on his face, came into the room. He didn't look stressed anymore. He knelt down on one knee so he could be at eye level with Illyra. He asked her if she was okay, and she nodded, wiping a bit of juice from her lip with the back of her hand. He smiled at her, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. He told her that she had done something wonderful. Illyra just shrugged her shoulders. She didn't really understand what the big deal was. To her, playing the piano was as natural as breathing. She couldn't understand why grown ups were making such a fuss. It was this very innocence that made her performance so special. She wasn't trying to prove a point, she was just sharing a gift she had. Out in the hall, the judges were having a serious discussion. Before Illyra walked onto the stage, they had been arguing about whether the competition rules were too harsh. They were talking about technique, precision, and interpretation. But now, their conversation was completely different. They realized that all those things they had been arguing about, technique, degrees, years of training, didn't matter as much as they thought. They had just seen that raw, natural talent could beat years of hard study in a conservatory. The head judge, who had been ready to go home early, stood by the curtain, peeking out at the audience. He saw the looks on people's faces. He saw the tears drying on cheeks and the smiles of amazement. He realized that music wasn't just about hitting the right notes at the right time. It was about telling a story. It was about making people feel something. Illyra had played a piece that was supposed to be angry and scary, but she had played it with such purity that it made everyone feel hopeful. She had turned a storm into a ray of sunshine. He shook his head in disbelief, feeling a deep sense of gratitude that he was there to witness it. When the break was over, the announcer walked back onto the stage. The crowd immediately quieted down. They thought there were more performers to see, but their minds were already made up. The next three contestants were very talented musicians. They had practiced for years, and they played very well. But honestly, it didn't matter how well they played. The magic of the evening had already happened. It was like trying to watch a movie after someone has told you the ending. The audience listened politely, but their hearts were still with the little girl in the dress. No one could follow an act like that. It would have been unfair to ask anyone to try. After the final contestant finished, the judges took their places at the long table on stage. The lights were focused on them. The organizer came to the microphone to announce the results. He didn't waste time with long speeches. He knew that everyone in the room was waiting for one name. He spoke with a smile in his voice. He said that while the decision had been difficult because the standard was so high, there was one performance that had stood out not just for its skill, but for its soul. When the organizer finally said, "The winner of this year's competition is Illyra," the roar that went up was even louder than before. It wasn't just applause, it was a release of emotion. People stood on their chairs. The judges stood up and clapped until their hands hurt. It was a unanimous decision. There was no debate. She had won. Illyra walked back out onto the stage. She looked a little shy as the spotlight hit her face. She was holding a large bouquet of flowers that was almost as big as she was. She had to tilt her head to the side just to see around them. She walked carefully up to the center of the stage where a large trophy stood. It was made of heavy gold crystal and was taller than her waist. She looked at it, then up at the presenter. He leaned down and helped her lift it. Surprisingly, Illyra didn't raise the trophy above her head like a champion boxer might do. She held it close to her chest, hugging it like a teddy bear. She looked out at the sea of people and gave a small wave. The crowd went awe again. She looked so small and vulnerable, yet she was the strongest person in the room. After the ceremony, the cameras and microphones swarmed her. Reporters wanted to know who her teacher was. They wanted to know how many hours a day she practiced. They wanted to know the secret to her genius. Her answers were simple and humble, just like her playing. She said she loved the sound of the piano. She said she liked the way the hard keys felt under her fingers. She said she imagined stories when she played, like knights fighting dragons or birds flying in the sky. She didn't talk about hard work or scales. She talked about imagination and fun. This made the reporters stop and think. They realized that sometimes we adults overcomplicate things. We think success only comes from suffering and strict discipline. But Ilora showed them that sometimes, success comes from love. She played because she loved it, and because she loved it, she became great at it. It was a simple lesson, but it was a powerful one. The next day, the news of her performance spread like wildfire. Videos of her playing went viral on the internet. Millions of people watched the small girl in the simple dress conquer the impossible song. People commented from all over the world. Musicians in orchestras watched in awe. Teachers played the video for their students. Parents showed it to their children. It wasn't just a cute moment, it was an inspiration. It reminded people that talent doesn't care about age. It doesn't care about your height or how many degrees you have. It just shines when it is ready to shine. But for the judges who were there that night, the memory was personal. They often thought back to that moment when they were ready to give up. They remembered how they were sitting in their chairs, feeling tired and cynical, thinking that the music world was losing its magic. And then, an 8-year-old girl walked out and proved them wrong. She reminded them why they fell in love with music in the first place. The competition changed that day. It wasn't just about finding the best technical player anymore. It became about finding the best storyteller, the person with the most heart. And every year after that, when the judges felt tired or bored, they would look at each other and remember Ilora. They would remember the little girl who played flawlessly, not to win a prize, but simply because she had a song in her heart that needed to be sung. In the end, Ilora didn't just win a trophy. She won the hearts of everyone who heard her play. She proved that even when the judges give up, and even when the odds are impossible, there is always room for a miracle. And sometimes, that miracle comes in the smallest package, with the biggest talent, playing the loudest music the world has ever heard. She walked off that stage a legend, leaving behind a silence that was no longer bored, but forever full of wonder.